Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the La Floresta wash-processed Colombia from Swerl Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Swerl, based out of Falkenberg, Sweden. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on several occasions, both of which during our Cafe Box Advent Calendar blind taste test series. And since those videos, I've seen their coffees appear at a number of multi-roasters, including a coffee shop nearby, which did prompt me to immediately purchase a couple of their coffees, as I very much enjoy reviewing coffee roasters that were featured in our Cafe Box Advent Calendar. So I'm looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Swerl's recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So it was kind of interesting thinking about how I was going to describe the roast profile of this coffee in this video. And that's because once upon a time, the term Nordic Light meant one of the lightest roasted coffees out there. But in modern coffee terms, that's not necessarily quite as light as some other coffee roasters roast out there. But this coffee reminded me a lot of Coffea Circular for a couple of reasons. The first of which being that I believe both of them do roast on the Gießen. In addition to that, both of them do have that lighter profile that is in line with what I typically experience from the majority of higher end Nordic based coffee roasters. So all of that's to say that this one is roasted on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics, if not necessarily an ultra light coffee by others. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the coffee was offering a surprisingly higher than anticipated intensity with a predominantly fruit-forward profile in line with the listed tropical aspects, plenty of brightness and sweetness lending itself towards a pretty nice first impression. And I do think that kind of took me a little bit by surprise, given that I wasn't entirely sure what to expect with this coffee roaster going into it. Obviously, we did have a couple of coffees from that advent calendar, but neither of which did advance to the final, kind of insinuating that these coffees might be good, they might be okay, but for the most part, the experiences I had weren't necessarily the most impressive experiences. So having this one come out as fruit forward as it was very interesting for that first try. Day 18 opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was a little different this time around, as it's still offering plenty of intensity, this time in a bit more Kenyan-like sense, with plenty of the red fruit brightness. This one is a pink bourbon, so that is something that could be expected within this coffee. Additionally, plenty of candied aspects, as the cup does continue to offer pretty nice sweetness, so another really nice experience yet again. Day 21 opted for the April Brewer, and it was another really nice day of this coffee, as it does continue to show pretty nice intensity in terms of that candied sense. The cup does continue to focus on the tropical aspects with a complementary brighter red fruit yet again, so it's been pretty solid. These first three impressions have all been very nice and well above the expectations that we had had. Day 24 through the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and the coffee was the best it had been to this point, which was a very nice experience, as there's better candied attributes, including plenty of the listed stone fruits this time around. The cup does continue to remain reminiscent of Kenyan coffees with plenty of brightness and a slightly tart sense, as the cup does continue to improve each time we brew it, definitely trending in a positive direction. Day 27 through the Chemex with Swerl's recipe, and this was the first time we'd had some mixed results, as it's good at two stages. Right off brew, it does have really nice intensity. It has a pretty neutral middle ground, but it does cool down and finish off pretty well, nicely candied in the red sense with the listed raspberry, but also a nice sweeter tropicality in the initial and cooling stages as well. Day 30 through the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and there were two possible takeaways from this experience. Either the coffee has dropped off relatively quick, or the coffee is slightly inconsistent, as it has the same base, but a little less sweetness and intensity, with the brightness shining through a bit more. Tropicality remains present as well, but once again, kind of mixed in general. And this one is a pink bourbon coffee, and people have said in the past that at times pink bourbon coffees can drop off a little quick, and that's what I was wondering if had happened with this coffee. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and more mixed results, as the cup does offer a bit of intensity, but it is skewing a lot more in the bright side of things with the berry qualities. Brightness also seems to shine through, as the cup isn't quite as direct and structured as it had been in the past. And on day 36, we opted for the V60 with Swerl's recipe, and there's a similar impression to recent experiences as it has seemingly fallen off relative to the extremely positive impression we had from it right from the onset. Cup does primarily focus on some lingering red berry aspects with a slight bitterness, both in terms of the berry and citric sense. The listed peach does come through after an extended cool down with the entire coffee, offering an abundance of fruit brightness for the majority of it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So this one, of course, as expected, is a very clean cup of coffee, as it does have really nice definition to a lot of the fruit aspects, most predominantly the berry fruit aspects within it, so nothing that could ever take away from that. Washed Colombian, for the most part, should finish in that range. Finish level 4, and it does skew a lot more in those brighter tart side of things, once again reminiscent of Kenyan coffees in that regard. So that's an interesting part of the finish for this one, and we'll kind of discuss that alongside of the brightness, because once again it did have that very bright pink bone like attribute to this one, even when the coffee has seemed to slightly fade from some really positive earliest starts. Then it hasn't quite necessarily, we'll say, dropped off in terms of the brightness of it. Sweetness level 4, and I want to say on some of the earlier days the candied sweetness in this one was even more abundant. Once again, just going through this coffee with its natural progression, there was one day where it seems to kind of flip, and from that point I could not get the same results that we'd experienced earlier on. And I would say on the later days, maybe the lower side of level 4 is still justified at level 4. Earlier days, definitely a very true level 4, especially in terms of the candied sweetness of the fruit profiles in this coffee. Then we have berry fruit level 4, and that's not surprising given that the predominant aspect of this one was raspberry. I think they have something along the lines of a raspberry milkshake listed on here, which in itself is already an interesting note, but definitely one that I could feel with in this coffee. Then a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the florality level 3, and that was kind of an interesting part as I wasn't entirely sure what to expect or make of the floral components within this one, but there was definitely, I would say, a little bit more of an undefined floral characteristic that was subtle and present in the background of this one, given that it was much more of a fruit-focused coffee. Citrus fruit level 3, and I feel like the citrus fruit was expanded upon throughout the time we were consuming this coffee, as from the earlier stages I would say it was definitely a much more subtle and tertiary characteristic than some of the much more abundant fruit profiles of this one. Even then, it does have a little bit of that brightness that kind of goes with the citric quality, so that's why we opted for there at that level 3. Stone fruit level 3. One of the other notes they have listed on here is peach, and at times, especially in the earlier days, the peachiness of this coffee was absolutely wonderful, and it gave the coffee some very nice fruit depth as you were experiencing a couple of factors, most predominantly that raspberry once again, but even at times the peachiness of this one was shining through also in a candied sense, and that's when I was enjoying this coffee the most. Caramel level 3, that is completely in line with the candied aspect of this one, as there's definitely a fair bit of candied qualities to it. Even as it has seemed to drop off ever so slightly, I wouldn't necessarily say that that has hindered the overall candied experience of the sweetness of this one. So level 3 is where we opted to put it. And then final thing worth discussing in this coffee is the body at a level 2. And that part's kind of interesting because I think on paper, especially with the brew method we opted for this coffee, it should definitely have a fair bit more texture and body to it. But even then, it did kind of finish on that lower side of things. Outside of that, nothing else worth discussing. I do think this tasting wheel is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. If this one would have remained as good as it had right from the onset, then I feel like this would have been one of my favorite Colombian coffees that we'd reviewed this year, as it definitely had some very high potential. And it is going to be kind of interesting when we compare and contrast it to the other coffee from Swerl that we are reviewing, because I think you'll just kind of see that when we do get to that review as well. But the early stages of this coffee were absolutely wonderful, and I can't necessarily explain what happened with this one. Once again, it was either inconsistency, or the coffee did drop off a fair bit, or of course it could be brewing error. But once again, it just did not seem to carry throughout the entirety of this one that same sort of intensity and wonderful fruit profile that it had from the start. But in those early impressions of this one, it was an absolutely wonderful coffee, and it initially grabbed my attention about this coffee roaster, and I do want to try some more things from this coffee roaster, but that's something we'll probably get into on our next review. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I think this is kind of an interesting suggestion. I think people that have positive experiences with Gießen coffees in general would probably like this one, whether or not it's actually roasted on that machine, because that's kind of the takeaway I had, especially on the earlier days, given my really positive experiences with Gießen coffee roasters in general. As this one, once again, especially on the earlier days, reminded me a lot of Café Circular's coffees. It had some really nice fruit profiles to it, some really nice intensity in terms of the sweetness, and even a fair bit of brightness that did give it some depth and characteristics to it as well. So I think if you like pink Bourbon coffees, that helps because it did have plenty of those much more bright and tart berry aspects to it as well. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the La Floresta wash processed Colombia from Swerl Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.